Oh, and Randy joined. Hello, biology. I'm currently
That's me.
recording your class, but two students decided to join me today. We have Mr. Garcia and Mr. Randy Reynolds. If you guys could say hi.
Hi.
Patty.
So, for the few of you that actually watch the videos, they're here. Randy, did you need something?
No, I just showed up.
Okay.
It's
Well,
for
I'm
fun.
just going to start talking about biology, and feel free to, I don't know, listen. So, chapter 21 was about plants. Chapter 25 is about animals. Both chapters are just about what's happening in general. Uh, as I said before, your final will probably be a test based off of chapter 21 and 25 together. So you have that to look forward to. Both chapters only have 2 sections, so it's not like it's a crazy amount of information. I think you guys will be fine. So let's go through 25.1 today. We got typical animal characteristics. That's a jellyfish, if you couldn't tell.
I actually could not tell that was a jellyfish.
Oh, you guys can't see. Maybe if I... Oh, I don't know if my computer can handle recording and putting that video up there.
I can't see the jellyfish for now.
All right, you guys want to see the jellyfish?
Yes.
All right, my computer is now recording and trying to stream and doing all sorts of other stuff. Here's the jellyfish.
I don't like that jellyfish.
That's kind of rude.
He bothers me.
So all animals have several characteristics in common. Animals are eukaryotic, multicellular organisms with ways of moving that help them reproduce, obtain food, and protect themselves. Most animals have specialized cells that form tissues and organs, such as nerves and muscles. Unlike plants, animals are composed of cells that do not have cell walls. We've talked about each one of those sentences in different chapters throughout the year. Eukaryotic, we talked about in the cells chapter. Multicellular organisms, again in the cell chapter. We know that things that exhibit the characteristics of life always reproduce. They have to obtain food, maintain homeostasis, and things like that. You have tissues and organs, which are specialized cells that do specialized jobs. And then that last part just differentiates us and plants, making sure you realize that no animal really has cell walls. That's a plant characteristic. So let's go over this idea of animals have to obtain food. One common thing about all animals is that they're heterotrophic, meaning they need to consume food. They don't just make food out of sunlight and dirt like plants do. They got to eat it. And there's all sorts of different ways that animals can obtain food. They each have their own specialized adaptations, but no matter what, all animals depend either directly or indirectly on autotrophs, which means they either eat plants or they either eat things that eat plants. All animals do one of those two things. They either eat plants or eat things that eat plants. But either way, the food always comes from the autotrophs. According to the theory of evolution, the first animals were probably in water. The reason why is because water has a lot more nutrients floating around in it than air does. If you were to just try to pick out all the quote-unquote food particles in the air, there's not nearly as much in the air as there is in the water. So things like barnacles and oysters, they don't actually even have to move. They can just like chill on a rock and the food kind of comes to them. These types of organisms are called, they're sessile organisms, meaning they don't move to find food. We cannot do that. If you don't move to find food, you're going to die. Now, some of these organisms that just plop down on a rock and start eating the stuff out of the water, they technically do move when they're little babies. They might end up being like these weird little, like imagine one of these little chunks floating off into the water. So usually when they hatch, they can float through the water and then they land on something and then attach to a rock and just chill there eating the stuff in the water. Humans, birds, snakes, all that stuff on the other hand, have a lot more things to deal with. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. They need to expend a lot more energy to be able to get any type of food. So these guys just sit and wait for food to come to them. But snakes, birds, you don't food just doesn't come to you. You have to go and get it. You have to expend energy to get food. So that is something that all animals have to experience a little bit. These organisms don't have to spend much at all, but things like this and you and I have to spend quite a bit in order to get our food. Okay, so we know animals have to obtain their food from either an autotroph or another heterotroph. But once we ingest our food, we have to digest it. Now, this is weird because some animals, like you and me and the snake and this bird, we have a digestive system that we kind of digest all of our stuff on the inside. Some organisms, spit out the stomach acid or whatever to kind of digest externally and then eat it. So there's two different things. And then there's even a stranger, something that might seem a little more strange. We have a specialized organ for that. We have our stomach, right, and our intestines and stuff like that. But there are organisms like this planaria that it doesn't actually have a really specialized structure or way of distributing materials. It's just small enough to where if this part is digesting food, the food will just pass from cell to cell through diffusion and stuff like that. So we have our complicated circulatory system to move stuff around in our body, but these simple organisms don't. They just move food from one cell to another. And we talked about a long time, diffusion and stuff like that doesn't really work for large organisms, so only the small ones can really get away with that. Some of the food that the animal consumes and digests is stored as fat or glycogen, and then we use that type of food when other energy is not available. So when you eat food, it's not like a fuel tank to where it just sits in your stomach until you use it. Your body will just turn it into fat cells or glycogen, as it says, and store that in different places, waiting for you to need that type of energy to use it. Otherwise, you'd have to be, constantly eating because the food would go bad in your stomach or something like that. But no, our body rips it apart, puts it into a new form, and stores it somewhere. Here we see an earthworm has more of a body plan like ours. The earthworm eats over here and poops out over there, and it has this single digestive tract that has a specialized organ system for its digestion. This thing does not. In fact, this thing only has one tube in and out. So food enters and exits through the same opening. It's called a pharynx. Kind of gross, but this thing doesn't really have a brain to think it's gross, so it probably doesn't mind. Most animal cells are differentiated and carry out different functions. We also have specialized cells that are able to sense and seek out food and mates. We can identify predators. We can protect ourselves. All sorts of animals have different adaptations, and all of our cells work just a little bit differently. But it all comes down to the basic instructions the same, but the specific instructions is usually a lot different. Let's go through how an animal typically develops. You guys will know the first part of this, but the second part you probably have never heard of. It's kind of interesting. So most cells develop from a fertilized egg called the zygote. But that zygote, you can turn into all sorts of different organisms. What I mean by that is a lot of different organisms first start out as a zygote and then multiply into something else. But it's even more confusing because a lot of organisms look almost exactly the same for their first couple of cell divisions. This is one of the reasons why the theory of evolution states that all animals have a common ancestor. The argument is, since all organisms start pretty much the same way, that maybe there was one organism all the way back in the day that started us all out as the same thing. So, first up is fertilization. Most animals produce asexually. Male animals produce sperm cells, and female animals produce egg cells. Fertilization occurs when sperm meets an egg. And this can be either external or internal, which means it can happen inside of the organisms or it can happen outside of the organisms. in the case of like fish, some fish. So fertilization happens, right? Sperm meets egg, the cells fertilize, it starts to divide. The cell divides by mitosis and cell division to form two cells in a process called cleavage. In this case, in this little frogs, we can actually see that like where this little material inside of that first cell is can actually determine whether or not an organism dies. Okay, so the first cell division is pretty important. Once cell division has begun, it's technically known as an embryo. Those two cells divide, and then those cells divide, and those cells divide, until eventually we get something called a blastula, which is a cell-covered, fluid-filled ball. Here's an actual picture of a sea urchin blastula. Here's a cutout of a blastula. Each one of those weird little sections is a cell, and it's filled with fluid. Right? In some animals, the blastula is a single layer of cells. In other animals, there might be a couple different layers of cells. And it takes different amount of time for different organisms to get there. It gives you an example. Sea urchins take about 10 hours to get there. Humans take about 5 days to become this little ball of fluid-filled cells, which is insane to think that everyone listening to this was at one point that. Just a non-thinking, fluid-filled ball of cells. That's pretty crazy to me. So that's a blastula. That's the process of blastulation. Okay, so we have a blastula. It's a fluid-filled ball of cells. After blastula formation, cell division continues, because obviously there's a difference between a ball of cells and what you are right now. After blastula formation, cell division continues. The cell on one side of the blastulas move inward to form something called a gastrula, a structure made up of 2 layers with an opening at one end. The book gives the example of, imagine you have a ball of clay and you want to make like a clay pot, or with like a vase or a hole in the center. You'll push in on one side and that kind of squishes in all the material. That's the analogy they use for the gastrula forming on this blastula that you were originally. Okay? And here we see an example of that. So you're a blastula, but then gastrulation happens, and these cells kind of start forming in to make this little inner area. I have a text message, but I'm in class, so there's no using my phone in text. No using my phone in class. So a layer of cells on the outer surface is called the ectoderm. The inner surface is called the endoderm. You guys might be familiar with those kind of words if you think about exoskeleton and endoskeleton. The ectoderm usually becomes the skin and the nervous tissue of the animals. And the endoderm ends up being the inside stuff, like your digestive tract and your organs involved with digestion. So your stomach, your intestines, and things like that. And if you think about it, this makes sense. Your ectoderm is on the outside, and that's your skin. Your endoderm is on your inside. Well, the only way, one of the only ways things get inside of your body is to eat them, right? And that's one long tube from your mouth to your butt, and that's pretty much what the endoderm is. Anything that's in that tube is the endoderm, and then the outside of the tube, your skin, essentially, is the ectoderm. Kind of a weird way to think about it, but if you take a second and really think about it, you are just a tube of meat. Kind of makes me uncomfortable, but that's what we are. Okay, so just to share with you guys, our security cameras picked up a cat walking all over my car last night. So that's what is distracting me. I thought it was something important, but no, turns out it was just a cat. Okay, moving on. In some animals, the development of the gastrula, of this guy right here, In some animals, that progresses until a layer of cells called the mesoderm is formed. Meso means middle. This says mesoderm. I say mesoderm. Apologies, I'm not going to stop saying mesoderm. It's the third cell layer, and it's in between the endoderm and the ectoderm. And this turns into all of our other types of organs that we have in our body, like our circulatory system, our muscles, excretory system, sometimes the respiratory system. So the yellow cells in this picture are your skin and nervous cells. Your green cells are your digestive cells. And then your red cells are pretty much everything else eventually. So again, at one point you were a single cell, then you turned into a ball of cells with fluid in the middle, and now you turned into a kind of filled out ball of cells with at least different types of structures. Those will eventually be different organs, but for now they're just little organization of cells. So there's two classifications of organisms at this point. There's protostomes and deuterostomes. If this opening right here, if that opening ends up being the organism's mouth, they are a protostome. If that organism ends up being the, I don't think the book actually says what it is. If that opening ends up being your butt, then you are a deuterostome. Humans are deuterostomes. Snails, earthworms, and insects are protostomes. Okay, so if this opening ends up being a mouth, you're gonna be either a snail, earthworm, or insect. It doesn't matter. Like that's what those organisms are, protostomes. And if this opening ends up being the anus, then you are a deuterostome. Humans, toads, snakes, birds, fishes, even sea stars, we are all deuterostomes. Eventually, over here, the mouth gets formed a lot later, but not right away. So these are already two classifications of systems where scientists would say they think that maybe a long time ago, every organism was a protostome, but then through the process of evolution, one class of species became the deuterostomes, and then essentially all the deuterostomes today come from the first deuterostome, whatever type of organism that was. Because these two characteristics kind of split the organisms into two classifications all the way back in our formation stages. So that's one way scientists help try to classify different things. Now, when it comes to growth and development, you'll notice even though this part actually is really complicated, we only go over a little bit because to go over the different types of growth and development stages would take forever. I mean, think about the human development stage, right? You're a little cell, and then you become a fetus, and then you're born, and then you're a kid, and then a toddler, and then a teenager, and then an adult, and then an old person, and each one of them have different characteristics and different developmental schedules. And then compare that to a dog. Well, a dog only lives, so long, but they're born already being able to do a lot of the stuff. And then compare it to these sea urchins, which start off as these free-swimming little spaceship-looking guys, and then they latch onto a rock, and then eventually they start to develop into one of these guys, which don't look anything similar to me, aside from the fact that there's, I guess, some spikes here and a lot of spikes there. So the growth and development is way different for every other organism. Think about bugs. Bugs go from an egg to a larva to an adult, and in some cases, the larva or the nymph phase looks the same, but in a lot of cases, it looks way different if you think about like a butterfly. So the growth and development, every organism has its own book's worth of specific instructions on their growth and development. But something that they all do have in common is that they do grow and they do develop, and they eventually become adults. And when they're adults, they're considered adults scientifically once they are able to mate, once they reach sexual maturity. So from a scientific point of view, that's when these organisms become adults, is when they are able to mate. But these are all different characteristics of life. All animals exhibit this stuff. And I think that's about it for 15.1.